Good morning, everybody. I have right at 10:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar for July 12th of 2022. My name is Ashley Edwards. I'm going to be doing double duty today, so I'm both your host as well as your presenter. If you're new to our webinars, just a couple of housekeeping notes before we officially kick everything off. If you've joined us online or through the Microsoft Teams app, you should be able to see a Q&A box, and that's where you can place your questions at any point during the webinar. If you've called in and are listening to us, you can text questions to me. My cell phone number is 512-818-5476. So again, if you've called in and are listening to the voice of this, you can text questions to me at 512-818-5476. I probably will wait to answer any of those questions until the end of the presentation. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk a little bit about selection and development of replacement heifers, more so in a commercial operation. So as we go through this, we'll talk about different selection traits, but we'll also talk some management strategies and how that the development of those heifers ties in with those particular traits that we're trying to select for. So the way that my mind works is I think of the end at first. I think of the goal. What is it that I'm trying to target? What is it that I'm trying to do? And so in terms of replacement heifers, whether you're talking your commercial operations, again, that's kind of what we're highlighting today, or we're talking purebred operations, we're thinking about developing good cows, okay? It doesn't just stop once she becomes a mature cow. So everything that we do, really from the time that that heifer is in utero, the time that she's developing within her mother, from birth through weaning, through puberty, through that first calf, second calf, so on and so forth, all of that ties into a good cow at the end of the day. So we have to think long term and think about that. We know that if our heifers get bred earlier during their first breeding season, they do make more productive cows. They are typically likely to breed earlier in those subsequent breeding seasons. And because of that, they're more productive and have a longer lifetime, more productive lifetime, and are less likely to be culled, primarily for being open. So if we think about the fact that we can get them bred early, that allows them more recovery time before that subsequent breeding season starts. So if there's anything wrong, if we need to put more weight on her, or she maybe just had a little bit of difficulty, needs a little bit more recovery time, she has that time. She has a time to start cycling all over again. And there's a lot of studies and a lot of literature that show that she'll continue to cycle early and be one of the first ones bred throughout her entire life. So how many heifers do you need? So this is, again, you kind of start and you have to do some, I guess, backwards math. The first thing you need to look at is how many females are you going to have culled, or have you culled? How many have you marketed? How many have you lost throughout the herd? So if you look at a nationwide average for your annual replacement rate, we're typically looking at 15 to 20% each year. Now, some of you on here might say this is different for you. You might say, okay, I've only, have a 10% or whatever it may be. Again, this is a nationwide average here. It will differ on each operation. So as we start to think about how many heifers, we know that we need to keep extras. We know that they're not all going to get bred. So I have the statistic here that about 60% of our replacement heifers will actually become pregnant by the end of their first breeding season. Of those 60%, about 70% we can estimate will meet selection criteria. And so these numbers are coming out of the University of Missouri, but they hold true throughout the nation that they're not all going to be perfect. They're not all going to be great. They're not all going to get bred. So the example that they gave was saying that, okay, you need 15 replacement heifers. At the very end of the breeding season, I need 15 heifers bred and ready to go into my herd. So if we assume 60% of those are going to be pregnant, and we do that math, that means we need 25 total to breed. And then of those, we're going to actually keep some. We're going to keep about 70% that are going to meet our criteria. So we're going to end up with 36 overall candidates. So if I work that back the other way, if I hold on to 36 at weaning, I try to breed them, and then I also go down and see how many meet my selection criteria, and that's going to get me down to that 15 that I'm actually need bred and ready to go at the end of the day. So you do end up keeping extras. That means that you do need to think in advance about how you're going to market those extra heifers, whether they're open or they've been exposed or bred or however it may be. You also need to think about if you have the space to be able to develop that many heifers and look forward into that aspect of it as well. Of course, there is the option of buying heifers if you need to go that route, if you don't have the space or the capability of developing them. So when we talk about actually selecting them, I have a few different selection criteria here that I think can work in just about every single operation that you have. Of course, you can come in, especially under the genetics aspect of this, that very last bullet, you can come in and you can get as detailed as you want to be. I like data, I like numbers, I like record keeping, so I like to be pretty stringent on this, but I also understand that a lot of times we have to kind of concede and there's a little bit of a gray area on some of these selection criteria and what we need from year to year. So when do we actually go in and look at these heifers and decide who we're keeping, what we're keeping? So we have post-weaning up here. You can do this right at weaning, or you can do it after a backgrounding period. That's why we have post-weaning on there. And then, of course, pre-breeding. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the selection criteria, that's going to fall under what are your production goals. I think that no matter what, you want a heifer that is sound. You want a heifer that's sound, you want one that's feminine, you want one that's got a lot of volume to her, a lot of capacity to her. And so all of that's going to fall under structural composition and soundness. We know that age and age at puberty is obviously going to have a large impact on when we can get her bred and ready to go into the herd. Weight plays a role in that, overall size, and we'll talk about weight and size being two different things there. We'll talk pelvic area measurements. We'll talk a little bit about temperament or disposition, and then genetics, as I mentioned earlier. So when we started, I said we're going to talk these different selection criteria, and we're going to talk management strategies that you can build in into developing these heifers so that they meet these particular criteria. Structural composition and soundness. I think that this, in some ways, could be argued that it's somewhat subjective, but we want them to be sound on their feet and legs. Okay, we want them to be relatively level. We want them to be feminine. Again, I mentioned volume earlier, so depth of body, width of body, the ability to carry a calf, produce milk, those sorts of things. Now, how picky you get onto or into, correctness of angles and all of those sorts of things, that's on you. This is a picture of a show heifer illustrating level design here. So we know that in our commercial operations, they might not always be this perfect and this pretty, but set your standards, realize what you want, understand that, work with whoever your management partner is in this, and y'all go ahead and decide, this is what I want for these animals. And each year continue to look through them. So overall soundness, of course, is key. It's that composition that I think sometimes we can start to nitpick and can get into gray areas there with those heifers. But obviously, you want them to sound on their feet and legs. You want them to have that volume to be able to carry a calf. All of those are very key fundamentals in selecting a heifer. So this is one place to just start automatically. Is she going to be structurally sound? Is she going to have what I need her to in order to be a good mom eventually? Age. A lot of times we automatically go into, we are keeping the older heifers. The older heifers and the bigger heifers are always going to be the better heifers. And while they might be some of the better heifers, I think that always is kind of a tough term to swallow there. So why is age so important? Well, they have to hit a certain age before they're going to hit puberty. And so basically they just have to age into getting their brain and their reproductive tract ready to go. We need communication between the brain and the reproductive tract. So that's that fun picture that you're able to see on the right-hand side of the screen there. I'm not going to dig into it. I put it on there for you to realize that it's complex. Getting those hormones up and going and getting them to where the the body is truly understanding what's happening and actually ready to support a pregnancy, it takes some time. And so puberty, depending on the breed of the animal, anywhere from 10 to 20 months of age. And I realize that's a big span. Here in Louisiana, we're looking at, a lot of times we're looking at purebred Brahman. Those are going to be later maturing. Some of our British and Continental breeds will be a little bit earlier maturing. So you have some genetic play in there. But the big goal, the thing that I want you to realize here is that third big bullet, in that we want them to calve at 2 years of age. Again, setting aside the purebred Brahman because they're a different beast. But we really want our calves, or heifers, excuse me, to calve at 2 years of age. From an economical standpoint, you are going to make more money over her lifetime if you get her to do that. Now, I know there's horror stories of heifers not being developed properly and having calving difficulties and everything else. Well, that's why we're talking about this today. If you get them developed properly, which you can do, they can calve at 2 years of age. So from a reproductive standpoint, this hormone standpoint, we need them to go through about 2 cycles before we try to breed them. So the very, very bottom bullet there says that a 21% improvement in pregnancy rate was reported when they were bred on their 3rd heat compared to their 1st one. So that's not to say that you can't breed them on their 1st heat. I've got here in just a second, I'm going to show you the slide with some numbers to reinforce this. But basically, you want them to go through at least 1 or 2 full estrus cycles, excuse me, and show heat at least 1 or 2 times before you breed them. So what influences this? I mentioned the genetics earlier. Breed's going to have a big role in that. Of course, their age, that's just something that we can't do. Some animals will mature a little earlier than others will. But nutrition is going to play a huge role in that, and we'll show that here in just a moment. So all 3 of those, the genetics, the nutrition, and the age, they all interact. They all affect body weight, rate of gain, metabolic factors, body composition. If you've taken our master cattlemen, you've seen that chart there. I think there's a lot of different ways to show it, but I think this shows exactly what we need to realize, in that it's not just one factor influencing age at puberty. Okay, it's not just going to be how early in the calving season were they born. So you have to focus on that nutrition. You have to realize that genetics can play a role. So I mentioned the breeds, but also you have some animals within a breed or within a herd that just mature earlier. That's going to happen. So that's something that you can keep records on and realize from one generation to the next, that, hey, maybe all the females from this particular line, they hit puberty, a few days earlier or so than some of their counterparts within that particular herd. So how do we know that she's hit puberty? There's a couple of different ways to do this. The first one is going to be reproductive tract scores. So this takes some practice. A lot of times you're going to get a veterinarian out there to do this, because they are going to go in and they're going to palpate, and they're palpating the ovaries. So this is repeatable. It is accurate. What it does is that, again, they go in, they palpate the ovaries, and they see if there's any follicles developing there or not. So we need follicles to develop because we need them to ovulate so that we can have a pregnancy. And so you can see in this chart here, reproductive tract score of 1, they can't palpate any follicles on them. So basically her ovaries are not responding to any hormones yet. She's not producing any estrogen yet. We're not getting follicle development. You're not going to have ovulation. She's not going to get pregnant. And then as you progress all the way down to a reproductive tract score of 5, on a 5, you can see that corpus luteum. And what that means is that she has ovulated. So she is capable of ovulation. She is capable of getting pregnant. And then there's scores in between the 2, 3, and 4 to discuss different sizes of follicles on those ovaries. So again, this requires a lot of skill. It requires a lot of training. Most of the time it's going to be a skilled veterinarian that's going to come out and do this. And you can have them out to do this. You want to do it at least 4 to 6 weeks prior to the start of the breeding season. So again, if we get out there 4 to 6 weeks before we're going to breed her, that allows time for a couple of cycles. We know if she's going to be able to really be receptive during that breeding season or not. And so this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of seeing pregnancy rates and reproductive tract scores. This will also correlate a little bit with how many cycles that she's had. So if we see these reproductive tract scores of 5, again, that means she's cycling, she's had a corpus luteum. You can see the top left, that's pregnancy by artificial insemination versus the bottom figure, that is final pregnancy rate after a cleanup bull. And so obviously, if they've been cycling, they have more of a chance of becoming pregnant at the end of that breeding season. And then as we go all the way down to that reproductive tract score of 2, they could feel some very small follicles, but she wasn't maybe ovulating at that point in time when those scores were taken. And you see much lower pregnancy rates at the end of the breeding season for that. The other way to look at this, maybe you can't get an experienced veterinarian out there or for whatever other reason, you can use estrus detection tools. So you can go in and you can apply a patch, you can apply paint on the tail head, you can use a vasectomized bull with a chin ball marker, whatever it may be, to see if she's actually coming into heat. So you would go again 4 to 6 weeks out, you would apply whatever method you're going to utilize here. Every 21 days, you would change that out. So you would change out the sticker or you would apply more paint. On the chin ball markers, they're a little more complicated depending on how many females you have out there in heat. They might require refilling a little bit more frequently. They work exactly like a ballpoint pen. They press down on that on a ball underneath that marker, excuse me, and it will mark on their back. So every 21 days, that's when she should have a new cycle. So just as a regular, every 3 weeks, you change these out and you can start seeing, okay, she's coming to heat once or she's coming to heat twice or 3 times or whatever it may be, depending on how early you start those. I think this is a very invaluable tool to utilize. These are very cheap methods. Obviously, a Gomer bull or vasectomized bull is going to cost you a little bit more and you're going to have to maintain them. So that one might not be as feasible. But you can get patches and things very, very cost effective and go in and actually monitor and see whether or not she's cycling and she's having full heats. So the green patch that you can see here, that's 100% scratched off. They can scratch off all the way up to about, or I'm sorry, 50% all the way up to 100% would mean that she's had a good heat there. So that's kind of looking at whether she's coming to puberty and whether she's been cycling or not. So some management strategies there to think about. Again, we're going to talk nutrition as we talk in weight here. And both of those, nutrition and overall weight, are going to affect puberty, as we mentioned earlier. So from a production standpoint, we set a couple of targets for both breeding and calving. So to breed a heifer, we want her to be 65% of her mature weight at breeding. And then we want to make sure that we continue her on an adequate nutrition plane or a proper nutrition plane so that she's 80 to 85% of her mature weight at calving. And I should have this on there. I apologize that I don't, but also along with that calving weight, we want to make sure that they're at a body condition score of hopefully a 6 at a very, very minimum. At a 5, but on heifers, I always just say a 6 is what you want her at calving because she's going to lose at least 1 body condition score there as well. So why does overall weight matter? Well, the amount of fat on an animal does actually influence the production of reproductive hormones. So fat tissue produces a hormone that targets the brain that will produce some of these reproductive hormones to then go in and target the ovaries. And so the more fat on an animal, the more likely they are to go ahead and start producing these reproductive hormones. That being said, don't get your animals too fat, right? There's a lot of consequences associated with that from a health standpoint, from a calving difficulty standpoint. You don't want them too fat. It also hurts our pocketbook, especially right now. We would think about trying to supplement and feed these animals. It's just not cost effective either. So realize that we need to get them at this appropriate weight, at this appropriate condition, which does require a knowledge of the weight of your mature cows within your herd. So we do want to look at overall weight. However, it's not the only thing that we want to focus on. We are going to talk a little bit about overall size, frame scores, and pelvic area measurements here in just a few slides. So how do we get to this particular target weight? So if we know we want them to be at 65% of their mature weight at breeding, we need to set that. We need to set our breeding date. We do want to breed our heifers at least a month prior to the rest of the cow herd. So earlier I mentioned that we want to give them time to recover. We have to realize that these heifers are still growing, they're still developing themselves, and so they need more recovery time. So anytime you're breeding heifers for the very, very first time to have their first calf, we always recommend you breed them at least 30 days prior to the rest of your cow herd. So then you have to know, okay, I know when my breeding date is, how many days do I have from weaning until the start of my breeding season? Or if I'm going to synchronize and utilize artificial insemination, how many days do I have prior to starting that synchronization protocol? So we'll go through an example here and we'll follow this up on the next slide. If we wean on October 1st and we set our official day for the mature herd to start the breeding season is April 25th, subtract 30 days prior to that, what we're going to end up with is 177 days between October 1st and when I need to breed my heifers. So I have 177 days to get my heifers in shape to be able to start their own breeding season. Then I need to know how much weight do they need to gain over that 177-day period. So if the weaning weight is 550 pounds, if let's say my average mature weight is 1250, 65% of 1250 is 812 pounds. So they need to gain 312 pounds by the breeding season. So we determine the average daily gain, 312 divided by 177, and that's 1.76, or basically 1.75 pounds average daily gain from weaning up until the targeted start date of the breeding season for those heifers. So to put that into perspective, I went back and was looking at some of the data from our heifer development program that we had at the Hill Farm this past year. So we had heifers of different breeds. So we had, a lot of them were commercial, but we had Brangus, we had Charolais, we had Hereford, we had some Angus influence, we had a little bit of everything. And from basically pretty much from October 1st until we bred them in April, we were looking at about 1.85 pounds of average daily gain. So what we did was a maintenance ration. I say maintenance, they were still growing, but we weren't trying to push them too hard as we were backgrounding them and feeding them from October 1st until about mid-December. We were able to put them out on ryegrass mid-December. I think the official date was December 17th. And then final weights were collected in May, but again, breeding there in April. And so with the backgrounding period and then on ryegrass, they hit above this target. So I say that just to say that here in Louisiana, it is possible. 1.75 pounds average daily gain for that period of time is doable. We are very fortunate to have forage availability here. Heifers perform very well on cool season forages like ryegrass or a ryegrass mix. So there's different ways to do this. That is a possibility. So whatever your calculation comes out to be, you have to sit down and ask if it's feasible for your operation. So what forages are you going to have them on? Are you developing them through the summer? Are you developing them through the winter? Do you need to supplement? What feedstuffs are around close to you to be able to supplement them with if you have to provide some sort of grain? And so this is not a nutrition talk. I'm not an extremely strong nutritionist, but if you want help, if you need help figuring out what to do for your heifers, either from a forage standpoint or from some sort of supplementation, reach out to your local extension agent, reach out to me. I can sit down and look at it. It takes me a minute to think about it. And we will definitely get you on the right track from a nutrition standpoint to be able to meet these targeted weights. And I put this slide in here because you see it a lot whenever you talk heifer development, no matter who is giving the presentation. We have a different one in our Master Cattleman slides that show pretty much this. This is from Mississippi State. And so what I want you to realize is that regardless of your plane of nutrition, and I'll explain that in a second, but regardless of your plane of nutrition, as long as you hit your target date, your target weight, excuse me, by your target date, then you are okay. So what you can see here in this slide is the early that they're talking about there with the circles. They had an early increased average daily gain. Okay, so they supplemented them or whatever it was. I don't remember if it was actual supplementation with grain or whatever, but they gained a lot pretty quickly. And then you can see after about day 80 to 90 there, they kind of plateaued in terms of their gains. Okay, so they had an early fast gain and then they kind of plateaued versus the steady rate, which is the squares there. So they just had a steady average daily gain throughout this entire 200 days. Versus the late, where they gained slowly there until about 100 days, and then they kind of pushed them and they gained a little more quickly there at the end. So as long as you do this within reason, and again, that's where visiting with a nutritionist, with your local extension agent, we can help you with that. But as long as you do this within reason, you just want to hit that end target. So a while ago, I mentioned that we background and we were not pushing them very hard when we were supplementing them with a ration. So we wanted them to grow. We wanted them to gain. We didn't want them to stay stagnant, but they were doing kind of a slow gain. And then once we put them out on ryegrass, then we saw a faster or maybe a heavier average daily gain on them. So for our model, it kind of mimicked a little bit more of that late model here that you can see where they gained a little bit more towards the end of their development period. When I say a little bit more, we're talking maybe an extra quarter to half pound of average daily gain a day. So it wasn't doubling it. It wasn't anything tremendous there in terms of pounds per day, but they did gain a little bit more on ryegrass, what we would call a compensatory gain. So they just kind of gained a little bit quicker on ryegrass compared to what we had them in on feed. So just to reiterate, we hit their requirements while they were on feed. We were not starving them. They were gaining weight. They were doing well. We were just very cautious of how much we were feeding and we did not overfeed them. We allowed them to have a steady rate of gain, and then they gained a little bit more once we put them out onto ryegrass. So overall, you want to make sure they're getting the nutrients that are needed. So if it's from forages, if it's from adding in a little bit of a ration, make sure they're getting the minerals and the vitamins that they need. You can work with a nutritionist, you can work with one of us to make sure that those needs are being met. I'm not going to get into vaccinations today, but always want to point out that health is a big part of this. So if they're not getting the right nutrition, if they're not healthy, then everything else that I say today is not going to matter. So make sure you work with your veterinarian to get whatever vaccination protocol and health protocol you need set up for your particular herd. So earlier I mentioned weight versus size. And so we want weights. I encourage everyone, if you can have a scale on your place, have a scale on your place and keep weights so that you can see how they're doing. Assess body condition scores. I don't have a slide in here on body condition scores, but you do want to watch those throughout your herd and assess those a couple of times a year. But you also have to take into account overall size. And so we're going to talk about size from two different aspects. The first that you can see here is from frame scores. So you can go in and you can visually assess if two animals are the same size, right? You can look at that. Or you can go in and you can measure hip height, and you can use this chart that I have over here with a formula. It's pretty easy to plug in, but it will give you an overall frame score to utilize for that particular animal. If you can visually see it, why does it matter that you're actually looking at a number, a frame score number? Well, if you go back and you look at pictures of cattle throughout the decades, you can see that we always swing on a pendulum. So we go from really small to very large framed, back to kind of moderate framed, and we swing both ways all the way from small to large with moderate falling in between throughout the years. And so if you're visually assessing them and you're just saying, okay, yeah, they're all about the same size, are you slowly getting larger? Are you slowly getting smaller? Is it meeting your production goals at the end of the day? So I think that it's next month. I'm going to go ahead and put this plug in here, but we have Dr. Ryan Walker coming in and talking about cow size, mature cow size, and how it affects overall productivity and profitability within a herd. And so that will this will kind of play into that. He'll do a much better job explaining how all that can impact overall once you get to a mature size. But just in terms of your heifers here, realize that this is data that you can collect. This is something that you can keep watching and saying, okay, I'm maintaining a moderate frame size, or I'm staying a little bit smaller and that's where I want to be. I'm not saying you shouldn't, I'm not saying you have to be at moderate frame size. You need to meet your production goals, whatever those may be. I'm saying keep a number, keep a record, so that way you can say, yes, I'm falling right on point, right where I want to be in terms of my production goals. So whether that's smaller or larger or right in that middle. So the hip height measurement is very easy to get the measuring stick there. Just make sure you're measuring on the hip at the same spot every single time, and then you can plug all this into an Excel sheet and it will give you your frame scores. Then the second size measurement that I want to talk about today are pelvic area measurements. I know that this is very, very underutilized. It was not something that we utilized in our herd when I was growing up. But when we start to talk about dystocia or calving difficulty, and we again hear those horror stories and all of these things about how difficult it is sometimes to calve out heifers, this is one reason. So it's the size of their birth canal. And so what you will do, I have a picture on the next slide, but you go in and you take the pelvic area measurements. Again, I'll show you how that works in just a second. You take the measurements, so width times height, that gives you the area. You can look at their weight and you can look at their age, and that's going to give you a ratio. And so that's what the top chart is showing. I'm scared to try to use a pointer on here. I'm going to mess it up. The top chart is showing what that ratio is going to be. And then the bottom chart, you can see for the example of before breeding at 12 to 13 months of age, the weight, you can see what the pelvic area was and the ratio, and then you can see that they utilized that ratio to divide and to calculate the estimated calf birth weight that heifer can handle. So of course we go in, and it is important to look at the bull side of things. It's important to look at calving ease on the bulls for both of those EPDs, calving ease direct, calving ease maternal. Look at the birth weight EPDs on the bulls. But you need to look at these heifers as well. And I've got a couple more slides here to kind of show why that's important. So again, on how to do this, you're going in, you're rectally palpating. So you can't see that here, but you are rectally palpating. You're using this, it's called a Rice pelvimeter, and you are measuring the height of the birth canal and the width of the birth canal. And then you multiply those two together, width times height, to give you your area. And then you go in and you use, there's charts out there that you just plug those in to be able to find that ratio and calculate the expected birth weight that she could handle. So why is it important? Well, we know that dystocia happens in heifers. I've already said it a couple of times. But the single major cause of dystocia is the disproportion between the size of the calf at birth, so the birth weight, and the birth canal, right? So that's where the EPDs on the bull comes in, but it's also where the size of the birth canal for that heifer comes in. So a lot of times it's actually the pelvic height that's end up causing some problems there. But if I should have put a star, an asterisk, or something next to that third bullet that shows that pelvic size, independent of cow weight. So independent of her overall size, independent of her weight, that pelvic size, that birth canal size, is what affects calving difficulty. And again, I've got some numbers here in just a second that's going to reiterate this, but it's not always the biggest heifers that are going to have the biggest birth canals. And then realize that heritability of pelvic area ranges is moderate to highly heritable. So that means that the moms are going to keep passing them down to their heifers. And so it is something that you can look at, something that you want to plug numbers into. When we start talking about that genetic data that you can keep on a commercial operation, you're keeping your own data so that you can go through and look at it from one generation to the next. So these are some numbers that we've actually taken from different groups of heifers on one of the research stations. And you can see the ones that I have in the green boxes here. So at the top box, these are some of our older heifers. That's why they're tags 20 and 30. They're a little bit older than the rest as we go down the chart. And you can look at the pelvic areas there. So the heifer tag 20 weighed 536, heifer tag 30 weighed 628, but look at their pelvic areas. So the smaller heifer there had a larger pelvic area than the larger one, than the larger heifer, the heifer that weighed more. And then you'll see the same thing as you go down and look at the bottom green box there, comparing tags 190 to tags 220. Now, again, this is looking at weight. I don't have frame score or anything like that on here, but I just want to point out, and I have it there at the top, that large heifers or larger heifers do not always have larger birth canals. And so that just goes back to selecting the bigger ones, selecting the older ones might not always mean that she's going to be able to calve as easily as some of her counterparts that might look a little bit smaller, weigh a little bit less, or be a little bit younger. And so that's where coming in and doing these pelvic area measurements. They're not hard. It takes you a little bit of practice to realize when you're palpating exactly where you need to leave the pelvimeter to take that measurement. But it's something that you can very easily be trained to do, and something that you can continually do essentially for free once you buy the pelvimeter from year to year. Excuse me. So then temperament. If you know me and you've listened to any of my talks, you know that I'm going to have to include temperament in here. Our Brahman cattle get a bad rap for bad temperament, but it happens within all breeds. So you might see it written as disposition on some of the EPDs, but what it refers to is how an animal is going to react to human handling or any kind of stressor or threat, any new situation or new environment. And what we're seeing is that fertility, there's a lot of things that are impacted by temperament, but fertility is one of them. And so if we can select for our calmer cattle, they are going to actually gain more weight. They will actually be treated less, so they'll be sick less than your more temperamental cattle. And carcass traits are affected by this as well. So not just talking from a reproductive standpoint on our heifers, but if cattle are more temperamental, then their carcass traits, their muscle fibers are less tender. They're going to have less marbling overall. They have lower feed intake. Temperamental cattle have poorer immune systems, particularly post-weaning. And so there's a lot of things that come into play with temperament from a negative aspect if we start to keep some of these crazy cattle. So I know we all could probably sit around and share a bunch of stories about crazy cattle and what we've survived and what we've made it through. And you can cowboy up and you can be tough and deal with some of these cows, but from a production standpoint, and how their offspring are performing, how they perform, is definitely negatively impacted the more temperamental that they are. So I have quite a bit of text on these slides. I'm going to try not to harp on them too much because, again, this is something that I just find interesting and enjoy looking at. But there's a few different ways to assess and to quantify temperament. The first is going to be a chute score, and so that's when the cows are in the chute or calves are in the chute. You don't squeeze them down all the way. You can put them in the chute and you see if they're calm with no movement, they're restless, all the way up to a score of 5, which is where they're violent and continuously struggling within that chute. Pin scores, excuse me, you can see on the chart here. So you can place an animal in with a handler. If you're going to be utilizing any of these, I should say that you want the same person to score each time. That way you're consistent, because they are both, the chute score and the pin score can be slightly subjective. And so what I might call, you know, a pin score of 3, someone else might say, well, no, I think they're more of a pin score of 2. So sorry, when I get back down into looking at those pin scores, You can see the chart from the Beef Improvement Federation here. A pin score of 1 is very docile, non-aggressive. You can almost walk up to them and touch them. They just don't get excited. They don't really care about a whole lot. They'll walk pretty slowly and just they don't get very excited. All the way up to a 5, which I've always appreciated that they just put crazy in quotations for this, but will run over you, run over anything else in its path. I think this is a great definition that they put down here for this, but a 5 is very, very aggressive. And then you have the 2, 3, and 4s that are going to fall in between. And you can see that they get pretty descriptive on how they use this. So when I go through at the station and I'm utilizing this, even though I'm fairly familiar with doing these for a while now, I still just keep this chart. I keep this chart on my data collection sheet and I go through and I watch this. I will say that with a pin score compared to a shoot score, if you are going to be pin scoring, try to do it one animal at a time if you can. Until you're used to it, but also realize that some of our aggressive animals can make our calmer animals a little more flighty. So that's just something that you have to kind of pay attention to. If you have one that's a little crazier in the pen, you might need to get it out so that you can allow the other ones to show their true temperament as you go through and mark those down. So both of those, as I mentioned, were kind of subjective, meaning that we can our opinions kind of play into exactly which category they fall in, even when we have them written with descriptions there. One that's more objective, one that we can't really influence or dictate a whole lot, is an exit velocity. And so this also, unfortunately, though, comes into you need some timers to be able to do these. So they use rodeo timers is what we utilize. And you're looking at the distance that they travel, or I'm sorry, the time that it takes them to travel a distance of 6 feet. So again, how long does it take them to travel a distance of 6 feet after they leave the chute? So you give about 3 feet at the end of the chute, set the first timer, go 6 feet, set the second timer, and allow them to exit. So it does require a little bit of equipment here if you were to utilize this one, but the good part is it's a number. Okay, you can't change this. Your eyes don't change this. You're seeing a number on a screen. And so the way that I do temperament that I'm used to doing is the temperament score that you can see on the bottom of this. And that's where you take an average of the pin score as well as the exit velocity. So you have both a subjective and an objective measurement there, and then they fall into 3 temperament groups: calm, intermediate, or temperamental. And then you just decide, hey, I can handle some intermediate cattle, or I want all calm cattle, or however your production goals are set up and your operation is set up, you can decide which category you want them to fall into. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at that. But again, realize that more temperamental cattle are going to perform poorly or more poorly than the rest of the herd. That on top of the liability of you getting hurt and them getting hurt and everything else that falls into that. So then when we come into genetics, this is the last little selection trait or set of selection traits that I'm going to talk about here before we start to wrap it up. But I mentioned earlier, I was kind of focused more on a commercial operation with this. Obviously, if you have a purebred operation, you're going to probably have access to EPDs, to a lot of other data and records. But I think that is just as important to keep production records on a commercial operation, because then you know how each generation is performing. Then you can go back and you can say, these are my higher performing cows. And you can watch that and you can keep heifers from them when they fit your given criteria. So again, ask yourself, what are my goals? And I say goals plural. Okay, you're going to want several different goals. You're going to want to keep written records of performance of different things that assess these goals. Always, bulls are going to have a big impact on this. So I have to just make sure that even though we're having a heifer talk, you want to make sure that the bulls that you select do match to your production goals. Don't become too focused on one goal or trait. So I just said production goals being plural. See the whole picture. See what you want to have, 1 year down the road, 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, because realize that it takes us a couple of years to even get to seeing the performance of some of these calves, especially if we're talking our replacement heifers. By the time we breed the cow, she has the heifer gets developed, the heifer's calving. It takes us a while to be able to see any kind of change or notice any kind of change going on here. And so that's why it's so important to focus on the whole picture, have multiple goals, multiple traits that you are keeping track of, and you can formulate and set different indices or indexes that you can go through and utilize to select animals based on their performance on multiple different traits. And if you're unfamiliar with that, if you want help with that, just reach out to one of us and we'll be happy to help you do that. And so as we wrap up, let's say we've made it all the way through the breeding season. Okay, we developed our heifers properly. They've made it into the breeding season. What do we do now? Okay, well, first you want to make sure that they are bred and they stay bred. Depending on the method of pregnancy determination that you're going to utilize, you can test as early as about 28 days with blood. A vet can come in and ultrasound around 30 days or palpate as early as 45 to 60 days, usually post-breeding. So make sure that they are bred. Remember that an open animal is going to cost you money. As I mentioned earlier, go ahead and think about what kind of markets you're going to target for any of your open heifers or any of your bred heifers that don't meet the selection criteria. Maybe you had a wonderful breeding season and you have more than enough heifers bred. Go through and select out the ones that you want to keep and market those other ones as exposed or as bred, however you want to do that. My recommendation is always market them as exposed because you don't know what's going to happen once they leave your place. But you can go through and do that as you wish. I mentioned the body condition scores earlier. We have a wonderful PDF online on the LSU Ag Center website that will show you all the body condition scores if you're not familiar with them. Again, it's kind of like that temperament chart. I like to just have it in front of me. No matter how often I do it, I like to have a reference that I can go through and make sure that I'm staying consistent with myself. But make sure you're recording body condition score prior to breeding, at breeding, and that way you keep her in a good condition throughout the year. And then, of course, maintain your proper nutrition and health protocols. So overall, I know I went through this I feel like I went through it quickly, but I'm looking at the clock and it's been about 45 minutes. So to kind of wrap up, just general management tips. I'll say it over and over and over again, and y'all get tired of hearing me say it no matter what talk you listen to, but establish written goals and keep written records. You cannot make extremely accurate decisions on culling without having some data. So it helps when something goes wrong, being able to have numbers and being able to have data and things to look back on, records to look back on, help. Manage your heifers separately. I did not talk about this, but you want to keep them separate from the mature cows. They're going to have different nutritional requirements. You're going to have the earlier breeding season, everything else. And so you want to manage them separately, keep them in their own pasture, away from the mature cows. Manage for early puberty. So think again back to that nutritional plane that we talked about, selecting the heifers from cows that hit puberty a little bit earlier. Utilize some of those estrus detection methods that we mentioned. I've already talked the nutrition. Be consistent with your culling. Okay, again, an open animal is going to cost you money. If you have extra heifers and they got bred late, go ahead and sell the ones that got bred late. Maintain consistency when you go through and you actually cull, and be stringent about it. I mentioned calving them ahead of the cow herd at least 30 days. I put avoiding calving difficulty on here, but we can't always avoid that. But my point in that is take your pelvic area measurements and go through and look at this, select the correct bulls, manage them properly so that they are not overly conditioned. And then if you keep that short breeding season, you're able to be out there watching them all the time to hopefully help them with calving, because your calving season will be shorter. You're calving them ahead of the herd, the rest of the herd, so you don't have that interference. And then you're also giving them more time to recover before you start to breed them for the second time. So anytime I talk about replacement heifers, I always mention that Jason has a great document online called Taming the Terrible Twos. And so he and I think he's okay with me saying this, but we've said this before in some of our different talks, that getting them bred the second time to me is tougher than getting them bred the first time. And so there's a whole nother aspect to making sure that you maintain them after they have that first calf. And so there's more to it past this point. So don't just get their first calf on the ground and call it quits and say they're good, and just, you know, throw them out to pasture and not worry about them. Realize that it's going to take some recovery for them because they are still growing and developing themselves, plus producing milk, having that calf, and then getting bred that second time. So if you have questions on any of this, my contact information is here. You can, of course, always reach out to your local livestock agent. They're all wonderful and can answer all these questions too, or send you to the person that that you need to answer these questions. Thank you so much for your time. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions regarding the Beef Brunch series or this PowerPoint or anything else. We do have a couple of open months that I don't have topics selected for the Beef Brunch webinar just yet. So if you have something that you want to hear about, please give me a call or send me an email and say, hey, I think this is a great idea for a webinar topic. So again, Dr. Ryan Walker will be with us in August, and all that information is on our Beef Brunch website, which is lsuagcenter.com/beefbrunch. And he will be talking about that mature cow size and how to handle that in terms of productivity and profitability. So if you have any questions, I'm not seeing any here on the Q&A. If you have any questions in the future, again, just reach out to me. It's probably the third time I've said it. I'm happy to answer anything. Thank you all so much and have a great day.